At 22 minutes past 10 on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the compass bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, roughly 200 miles northwest of a speck of coral called Midway, and allowed himself to believe that the hardest part of the day was behind him. His four carriers had beaten off wave after wave of clumsy American attacks all morning. Not one enemy torpedo had found a hull. His fighters were still up, his flight decks were being readied, and within the hour he intended to launch the most powerful strike of his career against the American carriers his scouts had finally located to the east. He was the most successful carrier admiral alive. His ships had bombed Pearl Harbor, ranged into the Indian Ocean, and burned their way across a third of the planet without losing a single fleet carrier. He had every reason, that morning, to expect another victory. He had perhaps 5 minutes left in which to believe it. By the time the sun set that evening, 3 of his 4 carriers would be blazing, gutted hulks. The 4th would be a burning wreck by the following dawn, and the striking arm of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the finest instrument of naval air power the world had yet seen, would be destroyed beyond any hope of repair. What broke it was not a superior fleet. What broke it was a handful of American dive bombers that arrived, by a chain of accidents and stubbornness, at the one moment in the entire war when 4 Japanese carriers could be killed in the space of a few minutes. This is the story of how that moment was built, and of why the legend that has grown up around it, the legend of the fatal 5 minutes, gets the most important part of it wrong. To understand why Midway mattered, you have to understand what Japan was trying to do there, and it was nothing less than to finish the war. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy had won everything it set out to win, and could not decide what to do next. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the combined fleet, and the man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, understood better than anyone that Japan could not win a long war against American industry. His only hope was a short one. He needed to force the surviving American aircraft carriers, the ones that had been at sea and had escaped the destruction at Pearl Harbor, into a single decisive battle and annihilate them before the shipyards of the United States could drown him in new construction. Midway was the bait. A tiny atoll of 2 islands and a lagoon, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, it was close enough to Pearl Harbor that its loss would be intolerable to the Americans, and far enough from it that Yamamoto believed he could seize it and destroy any fleet that came to its rescue. The plan was enormous. It committed the better part of the entire Japanese Navy across thousands of miles of the Pacific in a scheme of dazzling complexity, with a diversion sent north toward the Aleutian Islands, a separate invasion force carrying the troops meant to take the atoll, Yamamoto's own battleships trailing far behind, and at the sharp end, the 4 carriers of the 1st Air Fleet, the Kido Butai, the mobile striking force, under Nagumo. It was the plan of a navy that had never lost and did not seriously imagine it could. But the disaster that overtook Nagumo that morning was not born in the waters off Midway. It began months earlier, in a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, and in a habit of mind that had settled over the Japanese officer corps so gradually that almost none of them could feel it. The Japanese carrier force that sailed for Midway was, ship for ship and man for man, probably the best in the world, and it is worth saying so plainly. Its air crews were superbly trained veterans who had been fighting continuously since 1937. Its carriers operated together with a fluency the Americans could not yet match. Its fighter, the Mitsubishi Zero, still outclassed anything the US Navy could put against it in a turning fight. But the very completeness of those early victories had bred a sickness the Japanese themselves later named. They called it shoribyo, victory disease, the quiet, corrosive assumption that because they had always won, they always would. It showed in a battle plan that divided the fleet into so many separate pieces that no part of it could support another. It showed in the certainty that the Americans could not possibly know what was coming. And above all, it showed in the belief that the enemy would behave exactly as Japanese planning assumed he would. He did not, because the Americans were reading Japan's mail. In the basement of an administration building at Pearl Harbor, a brilliant, eccentric officer named Commander Joseph Rochefort ran the code-breaking unit known as Station HYPO. Rochefort and his exhausted team had been chipping away at the main Japanese naval code for months, and by May of 1942, they had recovered enough of it to know that a major operation was coming against a target the Japanese referred to only by the map designator AF. Rochefort was convinced AF was Midway. Others in Washington were not, and thought the blow might fall on Hawaii itself or the West Coast. So HYPO arranged a trap. Midway was instructed to send an uncoded radio message reporting that its freshwater distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese naval traffic was intercepted, reporting that AF was short of fresh water. That settled it. Rochefort had handed Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, something no admiral is ever normally given: the enemy's target, his approximate strength, and very nearly his timetable. Nimitz used it with cold precision. He could not match Nagumo's 4 carriers, ship for ship. He had the Enterprise and the Hornet, and he had the Yorktown, which had been savaged a month earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and which the yard estimated would take 3 months to repair. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. 1,500 workers swarmed over the Yorktown around the clock, and she sortied from Pearl Harbor patched, not truly healed, but able to fight. That Coral Sea fight had already cost Japan more than it knew. 2 of the 6 carriers that might have sailed for Midway, the Shokaku, damaged, and the Zuikaku, her air group shredded and unreplaced, were both absent. Yamamoto went into his decisive battle with 4 carriers instead of 6, and never seemed to grasp that his margin had already been cut in a battle he considered a victory. So the 2 fleets converged, and the whole shape of the coming disaster was already set before a single aircraft took off. Nagumo believed he was hunting an enemy who did not know he was there. In fact, he was sailing toward 3 American carriers that were lying in wait northeast of Midway, in a patch of ocean the Japanese scouts were not searching, holding their position on the strength of a decoded secret, ready to ambush him the moment his own aircraft were committed elsewhere. The battle opened before dawn on the 4th of June. At around 4:30 in the morning, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway itself. 108 aircraft, bombers and fighters, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, sent to smash the atoll's defenses to prepare for the invasion. It was a routine, professional operation, exactly the kind his men had carried out a dozen times before. And at almost the same hour, a lumbering American PBY Catalina flying boat, one of many spread across the ocean on patrol, found the Japanese carriers through a gap in the clouds and got off the report that Nimitz had been waiting for. From that moment, the Americans knew where Nagumo was, and Nagumo did not yet know the Americans were anywhere at all. What followed for the next several hours was, from the Japanese point of view, a series of nuisances that never became a threat. Land-based American aircraft from Midway, a mixed bag of Marine dive bombers, Army B-17s, and torpedo planes, attacked the Kido Butai in uncoordinated groups and were slaughtered by the Zeros of the Combat Air Patrol without scoring a single hit. To Nagumo's officers, each beaten-off attack confirmed what victory disease had taught them, that American airmen were brave, badly trained, and no real danger. They were half right. The men were brave, and they were dying in droves. But they were buying time, and they were dragging Nagumo, minute by minute, into the worst decision of his life. That decision is the true heart of Midway, and it deserves to be laid out carefully, because it is where the legend and the history part company. At around 7 o'clock, Tomonaga radioed from over Midway that a second strike on the atoll would be needed. Nagumo had held back roughly half his aircraft, the reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, in case American ships appeared. Now, with no enemy fleet reported and Midway still resisting, he made a reasonable choice. At around 7:15, he ordered that reserve rearmed, torpedoes swapped out for land attack bombs, to hit the island again. In the hangar decks of the 4 carriers, crews began the slow, heavy labor of striking down torpedoes and hoisting up bombs. And then, at 7:28, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone, one that had been launched late, a small mechanical delay that would echo through history, reported American ships to the east. For long minutes, the report gave no indication of what kind of ships they were, and Nagumo, agonizing, waited. Then came the words that changed everything. The enemy force appeared to include a carrier. Now Nagumo faced a genuine dilemma, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because he has been mocked for it ever since by men who never had to make it. His hangars were in chaos, aircraft half rearmed with the wrong weapons. Tomonaga's Midway strike was returning, low on fuel, circling and needing to land. He could launch an immediate, ragged, unescorted strike against the American carrier with whatever was ready, and send it in piecemeal, without fighter cover, exactly the way the Americans had been throwing themselves at him and dying all morning. Or he could take the time to do it properly, recover Tomonaga's planes, rearm the reserve correctly with torpedoes, bring up his fighters, and launch one massive, coordinated, escorted strike that would sink the American carrier for certain. He chose to do it properly. It was, by every standard the Japanese Navy had ever taught, the correct decision. And it killed him. Here is where the myth enters, and it has proven almost impossible to kill. For decades, the standard account of Midway held that when the American dive bombers finally arrived, they caught the Japanese carriers with their flight decks packed wingtip to wingtip, with fully fueled and fully armed aircraft, engines turning, just 5 minutes from launching the counterstrike that would have destroyed the American fleet. It is a beautiful, terrible image. 4 carriers, 5 minutes from victory, annihilated at the very instant of their triumph. It comes very largely from the post-war memoir of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the airman who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and who was aboard the Akagi that day. And it is, in its central detail, almost certainly false. We will come back to what really happened on those decks, but that is where the first half of this story ends, with Nagumo committed to the correct, careful, catastrophic choice, his hangars full of fuel and ordnance, his reserve not yet ready, and 3 American carriers he still could not see launching everything they had against him. It took 8 hours to get every name and number in this story right, because the popular version of Midway repeats Fuchida's fatal 5 minutes, almost word for word, and the best modern research on the Japanese records shows those decks were never packed and ready the way the legend insists. If this is the history you want more of, hit like. 1 like. Nothing more. Thank you. To see how the killing blow actually fell, you have to follow the American carriers, because their morning had been nearly as confused as Nagumo's. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, aboard the Yorktown, held overall tactical command, and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the Enterprise and the Hornet in Task Force 16. Spruance is one of the quiet figures of this battle, and worth introducing properly. He was not an aviator at all, but a cruiser officer, cool, precise, and unflappable, given command only days earlier because the fleet's most famous carrier admiral, William Halsey, had been hospitalized with a skin condition and had personally recommended Spruance in his place. On the morning of the 4th, acting on the scouting reports, Spruance made the aggressive choice to launch everything at maximum range, gambling that catching Nagumo while his decks were busy was worth the risk of his own aircraft running dry on the way home. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is the part the legend never dwells on. The torpedo squadrons that flew straight into annihilation without a single hit, and the way their deaths, and not the dive bombers alone, are what truly doomed the Japanese fleet. Do not go anywhere. The American strike went out fragmented, squadrons launching at different times and flying different headings, and much of it never found the enemy at all. The Hornet's dive bombers flew off in the wrong direction and missed the battle entirely. But the torpedo squadrons found it. And what happened to them is one of the most harrowing episodes in the history of naval aviation. Torpedo Squadron 8, from the Hornet, was led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, a hard, driven officer who had told his men before takeoff that if it came to it, he wanted each of them to take a Japanese carrier down with him. Waldron found the enemy by pure instinct, ignored his orders, and bored straight in. His 15 aircraft, the obsolete slow Douglas Devastators, had no fighter escort. The Zeros fell on them and shot down all 15. Of the 30 men of Torpedo Squadron 8 who attacked, exactly 1 survived, Ensign George Gay, who was pulled from the water the next day after floating for hours under a seat cushion watching the battle unfold above him. They scored no hits. Then came Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. It was torn apart in the same way. Then, Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, torn apart in the same way. Across the 3 squadrons, of 41 devastators that attacked, only 6 came back. They scored no hits at all. By any measure a commander could name, the American torpedo attack was a total, bloody failure. Except that it was not, and this is the thing the legend of the dive bombers tends to bury. In dragging the Zeros down to sea level to slaughter the torpedo planes, the Americans had pulled the entire Japanese combat air patrol out of position. The Zeros were low, scattered, and out of altitude and ammunition, exactly when it mattered most. The sky above the Kido Butai, the high perch from which a dive bomber attacks, had been left open. The men of the torpedo squadrons had, without knowing it, and at the cost of nearly all their lives, cleared the way. And into that open sky, by an accident that no one could have planned, came Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky. McClusky led the Enterprise dive bombers, and he had flown to the enemy's expected position and found nothing but empty ocean. Low on fuel, with every reason to turn back, he chose to keep searching. He spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, steaming hard to rejoin the fleet after chasing off an American submarine, and he correctly guessed it would lead him to the carriers. He followed it. And at around 10:20 in the morning, from nearly 3 miles up, McClusky's dive bombers looked down and saw the Kido Butai spread out beneath them, its fighters at sea level, its decks alive with activity, utterly unaware of the death poised directly above. What happened next took not 5 minutes but roughly 6, and it is as close to a decisive instant as modern war has ever produced. McClusky's aircraft split between 2 carriers, the Kaga and the Akagi. At almost the same moment, arriving from a different direction by another chain of chance, the Yorktown's dive bombers, under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, tipped over onto the Soryu. 3 carriers, 3 streams of dive bombers, all rolling in within moments of one another. On the Kaga, several bombs struck home, one bursting near the bridge and killing the captain and most of the command staff, fires roaring through her from end to end. On the Akagi, Nagumo's own flagship, a single bomb, dropped by Lieutenant Richard Best, punched through to the hangar deck, and it was enough. On the Soryu, Leslie's bombers landed 3 hits in quick succession, and she was ablaze within minutes. Now we can say what those decks actually held, because it matters. The armored hangars of the Japanese carriers were not packed with fueled aircraft ready to launch. They were, far worse, in the middle of the frantic rearming that Nagumo's careful decision had ordered. Aircraft were being refueled and rearmed below decks, and the hangars were strewn with the ordnance that had been struck down and not yet stored, bombs and torpedoes lying about because there had been no time to return them to the magazines, fuel lines charged and open. The Japanese carriers were not 5 minutes from launching. They were, if anything, the most vulnerable they could possibly be. Their aircraft below, their weapons scattered, their fuel systems full and exposed. The American bombs did not merely hit ships, they hit powder kegs. The secondary explosions of their own ordnance, cooking off in the hangars, did more to destroy the Kaga, the Akagi, and the Soryu than the American bombs themselves. The fatal 5 minutes of the legend describes a counterstrike that was never as close to launching as Fuchida claimed. The real catastrophe was quieter and more terrible. 3 ships turned into infernos by the fuel and bombs of their own interrupted preparations. 3 carriers were mortally wounded in those few minutes, but the 4th was not. The Hiryu, steaming somewhat apart from the others, had been missed entirely, and aboard her was the one Japanese admiral who would come out of this battle with his reputation enhanced rather than destroyed. Rear Admiral Taimon Yamaguchi was aggressive, brilliant, and widely regarded as a future commander of the whole Navy, and while his fellow flag officers watched their ships burn, he launched what he had left. Through the early afternoon, the Hiryu's air crews found the Yorktown and attacked her twice. First with dive bombers under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, then with torpedo planes under Tomonaga, the same officer who had led the dawn strike on Midway, and who is generally believed to have flown his second mission that day, knowing his damaged aircraft could not bring him home. The Yorktown was hit hard, set afire, and eventually abandoned. For a few hours, the Japanese aboard the Hiryu could tell themselves they had traded evenly, an American carrier, for the wounds inflicted on their own. It did not last. Late in the afternoon, American scouts found the Hiryu, and a strike from the Enterprise, including a number of orphaned bombers from the crippled Yorktown, dove on her out of the setting sun and left her burning like the others. Yamaguchi refused to leave his ship. He gathered his crew on the listing flight deck, gave a short farewell, distributed what remained of the drinking water, and remained aboard with the Hiryu's captain, Tomio Kaku, as she was scuttled the following morning. It is the kind of end that the Japanese officer corps of that generation had been raised to seek, and whatever one thinks of the code that demanded it, the man did not flinch from it. Here is how it unfolded in order. Before dawn on the 4th of June 1942, Nagumo launched 108 aircraft against Midway, while 3 American carriers waited, undetected, to the northeast. Through the morning, Midway's aircraft and the American torpedo squadrons attacked in fragments and were slaughtered without scoring a hit. At around 7:30, Nagumo ordered his reserve rearmed for a second strike on the island, then learned an American carrier was present and reversed himself, choosing to prepare one coordinated strike. At around 10:20, with his hangars full of fuel and loose ordnance and his fighters dragged down to sea level, American dive bombers fell on him and mortally wounded the Kaga, the Akagi, and the Soryu within roughly 6 minutes. That afternoon, the surviving Hiryu crippled the Yorktown before being found and destroyed herself. 2 days later, on the 6th and into the 7th of June, the Japanese submarine I-168 finished the abandoned Yorktown and sank the destroyer Hamon alongside her, and the battle was over. The factors behind that annihilation are worth naming plainly. The first factor was intelligence. Rochefort and his codebreakers gave Nimitz the enemy's target and timing, and an ambush is only possible when you know where the other man intends to stand. Without HYPO, there is no battle at Midway, only a raid the Americans discover too late. The second factor was the tempo of the American attacks, ragged and costly as they were. The torpedo squadrons died almost to a man and hit nothing, but they pulled the Japanese fighters out of the sky at the decisive moment, and without that sacrifice, the dive bombers would have been met and broken. The third factor was Nagumo's rearming dilemma, which is less a blunder than a trap. Every choice available to him was bad, and the careful, professional one he made left his ships at their most flammable, exactly when the bombs arrived. The fourth factor was chance itself, honest and undeniable. A late scout plane, a destroyer that led McClusky to the fleet, 3 separate American squadrons converging on 3 separate carriers within moments of one another after a morning of nothing going right. Battles are not usually decided this cleanly, and this one very nearly was not decided at all. Strip away the maps and the casualty counts, and Midway comes down to a single reversal worth stating plainly. The Japanese plan was built entirely on surprise, on the certainty that the Americans could not know what was coming and would arrive late, confused, and outnumbered. Instead, the Americans knew everything that mattered, and it was Nagumo who was surprised, who arrived believing he was the hunter, and discovered in the space of 6 minutes that he had been the prey the whole time. The most surprise-dependent operation of the war was undone because the one thing it could not survive, an enemy who already knew the plan, was the one thing waiting for it. There is a second reversal folded inside the first, and it belongs to the men who failed. The popular version of Midway makes it a story of heroic dive bombers who won the battle in 5 minutes over decks packed with doomed aircraft. But the decks were not packed and ready, and the dive bombers did not do it alone. It was the torpedo squadrons, the ones who missed, who died, who accomplished nothing you could measure, whose annihilation cleared the sky. The men who are remembered as the failures of Midway are the men who actually made the victory possible, and the glittering 5-minute image that gets all the attention rests on a foundation of 40 men shot into the sea for nothing that anyone could see at the time. The reckoning fell hardest on the men and the ships that Japan could least afford to lose. 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, went to the bottom, along with the heavy cruiser Mikuma, sunk in the retreat. Something on the order of 240 aircraft were lost, and with them, a corps of veteran aircrew, and worse still, the irreplaceable pool of skilled mechanics and maintenance men who went down inside the burning hangars and were never counted properly in the legend. Somewhere over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen died. The Americans lost the Yorktown, the destroyer Hammond, about 150 aircraft, and 307 men, a great many of them from the torpedo squadrons. It was, for the price paid, one of the most decisive victories in the history of naval warfare, and it broke the offensive power of the Japanese Navy in a single day from which it never recovered. The men carried it forward in the way men do. Rear Admiral Taimon Yamaguchi went down with the Hiryu, the ablest carrier Admiral Japan had, lost in the same battle that destroyed his fleet. Vice Admiral Nagumo survived Midway, but the victory disease and the confidence were gone. He was shuffled aside into lesser commands, and in July of 1944, cornered on Saipan, as the Americans closed in, he took his own life. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, whose stubborn refusal to turn back found the carriers, was wounded that day, survived the war, and retired an admiral, remembered as the man whose decision Nimitz himself credited with deciding the battle. Lieutenant Richard Best, who put the bomb into the Akagi, flew his last combat that same day. A faulty oxygen canister had exposed him to caustic soda, reactivating a latent tuberculosis, and the man who helped kill 2 carriers in a single morning never flew in combat again. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, lived into old age and asked to have his ashes scattered over the waters of Midway so that he might rejoin the 29 men he had watched die. Commander Joseph Rochefort, whose code-breaking made the ambush possible, was denied the recognition he had earned for years by Navy politics, quietly pushed aside, and only awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in 1985, more than a decade after his death. The ships lie where they fell, in some of the deepest water in the Pacific. For more than 70 years no one had seen them, and then in 2019, a research expedition located the wrecks of the Kaga and the Akagi on the ocean floor, more than 3 miles down, sitting upright in the dark and the cold, remarkably intact. The Yorktown had been found decades earlier, resting on the bottom 5,000 meters below the surface, still recognizably herself. They are war graves now, undisturbed, thousands of feet beneath a stretch of ocean that has gone back to being empty and blue and quiet, with nothing on the surface to mark what happened there on a single morning in June of 1942. Both sides, in the end, agreed on the one thing that mattered. The Americans came away knowing they had stopped the Japanese advance cold and seized an initiative they would never surrender. The Japanese survivors, interviewed long after, spoke of Midway as the moment the war turned, the day the invincible fleet learned it could be beaten, and beaten not by a bigger navy, but by a smaller one that had simply known where to wait. The plan had been dazzling. The ships had been superb. The men had been brave on both sides beyond any reasonable measure, and it had all come apart in about 6 minutes, because an enemy who was supposed to be surprised was reading the mail, and because 40 men in obsolete torpedo planes flew into certain death and, without ever knowing it, opened the sky. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because every week we tell you how America actually won its war, the real machines and the real men, and the decisions history has quietly rewritten, without the myths and without the easy exaggeration. Hit subscribe, then like, so this reaches more people who should understand what really happened over Midway. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one.